Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, June 5th edition of the Cluster API Office Hours, a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have a pretty big agenda today, but if you have any additional topics that you want to bring up, please go ahead and add them to the agenda now, and also add yourself to the attending list. I just want to remind everybody that we have established meeting etiquette and to use the raise hand feature in Zoom. If you want to respond to a topic, and also if there's any topic that you want to bring up that is tangential to an item currently being discussed, please add it to the agenda as a new unrelated topic. And I am going to try to do my best to moderate as we go along. I've added some time boxing to the agenda items as well, so let's try to go ahead and keep conversation within those bounds. And the first item on the agenda today is Vince with the versioning and releases documentation PR.
Yes, thank you, Jason. We opened this last week, and it just adds some information to the README about like what we do for versioning, maintenance, and compatibility. It's mostly kind of copied from the controller runtime, and it's meant to be very short. The summary of it is like we would like to release Cluster API when there's a Kubernetes release plus 6 weeks. And for each release, we will open up a new release-x branch following the convention that we have today.
All right. So if you get a chance, please go ahead and look at that pull request, add any comments to it. I believe we're coming near the initial 1 week kind of timeout that we assigned on there. So what are your thoughts on lazy consensus from here, Vince?
I've seen like some people like approved, and David gave a GTM. So if there isn't like not a more comments on it, like I would like to merge this today at the end of the day.
Sounds good. Any questions, comments, concerns there? Yep. All right, moving on to the next item. VMware has recently open sourced a cluster upgrade tool that we've started to work on that works within the bounds of the V1 Alpha 1 data types. Since there are folks that have discussed this with me in the past, and I've shared a document that I created in the past around a potential upgrade path for V1 Alpha 1 Cluster API built clusters. This upgrade tool is basically an implementation of that document, and it's still very much a work in progress. So keep that in mind. But we are more than happy to get people to take a look at it and contribute if you like. And I see Andy, you had a comment?
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to say that I'll echo it's a work in progress. We've only tested it against the AWS provider. It has a set of prerequisites and expectations for the way that the machines have been provisioned in order for it to function correctly. And it definitely should not be used against production clusters. We haven't implemented idempotency for it right now, so it's kind of a relatively unintelligent loop when it tries to upgrade the control planes or control plane machines, and if it hits any errors, it just throws its hands up in the air and stops. So we certainly expect that there need to be improvements, and we have some open issues, but we would love to have people kick the tires.
Tim.
Just for clarification for other people who might not understand why it's external. In the future, once CRDs have the webhook validation thing, this is something we plan to address in cluster API providers, correct?
So the main reason that it's a separate project right now is that Cluster API doesn't currently manage control plane machines in any sort of orchestrated fashion for upgrades. And while we could put the logic or try to put the logic into Cluster API, we feel that the machine bootstrapping proposal, which we'll be discussing in a few minutes, is a prerequisite along with adding proper control plane support to Cluster API. So we don't want to keep this project alive forever. We want it to potentially be helpful to anybody who's trying to manage V1 Alpha 1 clusters, but we fully intend to take as much of the logic that makes sense that's in here and lift it and shift it into Cluster API so everybody can use it without having to use a third-party project for it.
All right, moving on to the next topic, which is the Cluster API machine states and bootstrapping proposal. Vince?
Yes. Tim, did you want to do like kind of the SIG charter before I go into the introduction for this proposal?
Sure. I just wanted to reiterate, there's been a lot of comments that have occurred about the idea of what's the purpose of separating things out. And I want to make sure that or having certain behaviors be totally orthogonal to the notion of Kubernetes clusters. The SIG charter, as well as the charter for the KEP for Cluster API, explicitly specifies the scope boundaries for what's in scope and out of scope for both the SIG as well as the project itself. And there's an explicit clause that specifies that we're not creating Terraform type tools. It's related to Kubernetes clusters themselves. So I just want to make sure that we keep that in mind as we start to have this discussion. So with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. So for new folks that have just joined the project, we went in the past couple of months into all the feedback that we received from the V1 Alpha 1 providers implementation and upstream implementation as well. And we found out that there have been a lot of kind of shortcomings in the initial implementation, which were to be expected. We took kind of an approach of saying maybe we should split the Cluster API into work streams, and we did so for the month of April and May, which then have been closed. And we kind of gathered a lot of feedback, a lot of use cases, and a lot of good brainstorming. And during KubeCon, a few folks chatted and there was a strong interest to keep the scope small. And this PR is this proposal is the result of that wish. So we're kind of trying to scope everything down to just the machines and introducing states and transitions and kind of cutting out the bootstrap mechanism into its own controller. So machine will kind of reference a specific external bootstrap mechanism, but while still giving users the ability to bring their own if they want. Could you please mute if you're not talking? Hear some noises. If the document is linked, I will share my screen though to just go over quickly. This is kind of where everything started. This is from the work stream that was called the Node Lifecycle Management work stream. That work stream kind of did a good job specifying the states and the transitions and at a very, very, very high level. And this is kind of reported here as well in this diagram. I hope everybody can see it. I can zoom in if that's necessary. We kind of go from machine create and all the steps from the creation of a machine from a user perspective that need to be taken. This is not final at all. This is more what we're thinking about, and the proposal is meant to be kind of the starting point, and after we kind of merge it, there's always room for iteration. Nothing is ever final in the purpose of this proposal. So this is kind of the states transition that we would imagine a machine to have. So we go from pending to provisioning to running, and then the deletion state as well. These have been like less worked on as of right now, and we have been focusing on like this part, like especially because it involves the bootstrap mechanism. One of the feedback that we received and we saw like from like having like a lot of infrastructure providers is that, for example, like a lot of them like Azure, GCP, AWS, and vSphere, they all kind of like do their own implementation of kubeadm. And it would be great like if to have this implementation outside of Cluster API and like kind of reuse it in a generic fashion, if that's possible. The summary and motivation for this proposal, as I mentioned, like came from like a lot of feedback that we have received, and the goal is to just work on machine for the goal of this proposal, and to make sure that machine goes from like it being an infrastructure object or like just like a generic machine to a Kubernetes node. That's the charter of like Cluster API to like manage Kubernetes clusters, and we reiterate on that in this proposal as well. We don't change the cluster object. We know that the cluster object has like its own like kind of quirks and limitations, but it won't. We won't go into that as well here. With that, like I think I'm at time, and would like to go on for the other on the other points that have been in here. One other thing is I would like to propose to turn the document into a pull request and to a full spec proposal by this Friday, and then give it like a week timeout to kind of merge and maybe like start the work on it. As I mentioned, the proposal is not final, and like there have been there's probably like a lot of like open questions, but we can address them like as we go.
All right, and the first follow-up item is for Leah about the user stories.
I just felt like in the doc, all of the use cases when I first looked at it were about they're like users of like operators of clusters, not about the implementers of the API, like the people who have to be on the other side implementing the controllers. We have some now in response to my request in the agenda, but I just feel like it's important to focus on all of the sides of the users, especially when most of the actual design in the KEP is focused on what do the people implementing and like on the implementation side need. If that's what we're going to focus on in the design, I feel like we need use cases to like sort of corroborate that design.
All right, thank you. Pablo, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't have time to raise my hand because my comments for the previous topic or just the deadline. Given that there are a lot of minor elements are contentious, do you think that 1 week is probably too short, probably 2 weeks? I mean, it's only just for consideration of the group. I think that overall we have a good agreement, but there's a couple of elements that maybe probably based on the comment I have written so far, that probably require a little bit more, or 1 week with an extension, not forcing this week, just in a proposal.
Do you have a response to that, Vince, before I follow up with the other question?
Yes. I think we can definitely push the like to 2 weeks if like as needed. As I mentioned though, like we don't want to take too long to like get this proposal in because it's not like a final state. We can always go back and like revisit the proposal as time passes by. One of the things that like upstream Kubernetes does is merge early and then update the proposal as we go, because implementation is going to be much different in what we can actually think about, because like there's like code constraints and technical constraints like we'll probably go into, and we'll like a lot of these things will probably come up as well. So if we can, I would really like to get into the 1 week time frame, and then as Tim mentions, like like in a provisional state, and then we can refine as we go.
All right, I believe Doug was first.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, I think basically what Vince just described is we would land it provisional, and then there's some process for deciding when it's no longer provisional and it's implementable, I guess. Is that the phase we wanted to end up in? So how does that work? How do we get it to that state?
All right. So basically, the general way that happens is discussion among the stakeholders, and then also, we would decide. We would bring up the topic in the meeting here, and then there would be a lazy consensus vote along with a PR to change the status.
Okay, cool. So we would land it in some rough state and then iterate on it and then get it into a state where everybody's actually happy with it before we do that. Okay,
Correct.
cool. Thanks.
And I believe Michael was the next one.
Yeah, I want to bring up that we just changed the scope last week about what it is we're all trying to do here. And since then, this is the only proposal that's been created in this newly defined scope. And I keep hearing how we want to merge this proposal in a week, and there has not been time afforded for other people to contribute proposals counter to this one and discuss alternatives. And because this proposal is very different from what we discussed in the work streams, this individual concept of these particular changes are all brand new in this proposal. So it seems like there's an implied consensus already, and there needs to be time to discuss this particular proposal and whether or not we should move forward with this particular proposal in place of some other proposal.
Doug?
Oh, yeah, I feel like that's kind of what we talked about just a second ago, although we didn't really talk about other proposals. So I assume that if there were other proposals, they would go through a similar sort of process where, write up a document like this, talk about it in a meeting, get the PR landed with it in a provisional state, and then, either accept one or the other or reject both or whatever, right? I'm seeing Vince nod.
I see agreement from Tim as well.
Okay.
Andy, did you have a comment there?
I did just want to clarify that we did talk about the scope at last week's meeting. I'm reviewing the notes, and we did bring up the idea that we could reduce the scope to machine states and bootstrapping this proposal. So I think people have had at least a week to potentially suggest alternatives. So I just wanted to mention that.
Sorry if I'm speaking out of turn. I can't find the raise hand button, so I added it in the chat. So the reason I agree with Michael in terms of having more time is I feel like this proposal incorporates a lot of ideas that we've been talking about for a long time. But it wasn't until earlier this week that I first had the opportunity to start reading it. I think I agree with Tim as well that, independent of my current understanding, it's fine to be provisional and we can iterate on it. The main concern I have is that as I've been reading through this, I've become more and more convinced that this is the right conceptual model. But I know that when the extension work stream was a thing, it wasn't clear to me that people understood some of the things that Daniel Smith, Brian Grant, Jordan Liggett, the kind of things that they would give us feedback on in terms of API design. And so my concern about pushing forward on this quickly, and again, I saw this Monday, so I've been busy, I barely read it, and I could be totally off base here, but I feel like it's important to get the conceptual framework approximately correct, because it'll save a lot of time when we're debating this. So I don't know that that's an actionable comment, but that was my observation.
All right, Pablo is next.
Yes, briefly, it's like just to make clear, I mostly agree with this proposal. That's not something bigger against, but the process for me, I'm not feeling like it's. I don't really like the way it's happening. I've been saying it's like, I don't mean to sound the worst, right? It's like transparency, a little bit like a transparency for the large community. Maybe the people who was more closely involved know what's happening, and this is not that there is any lack of trust from the people who is driving this forward, nothing like that. But I think that this landing here, if you don't were in the KubeCon, or you don't were aware of these conversations, I think that we were doing some work in the work streams, and and the same happened with the work, for instance, in the extension mechanisms. I just heard as a comment in the conference that there will be a proposal, a new proposal, which is different to the other two that we were discussing. And if we repeat this process, I don't know if this is the best way for move forward. Even in this particular case, I don't have any objection on the proposal itself. It's more like the mechanisms. I think that we should try to fix this at some point. Again, sorry, I mean, don't mean to say this something wrong. It's just I think probably could be more transparent somehow.
Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I also like the underlying proposal. I think there are concerns about the process. I also wanted to say, I guess I liked the way the VMware upgrader thing was sort of happening externally and building sort of evidence. And I was just wondering whether we are blocked from doing that here. Like, in other words, whether or not we decide to merge this today, like, can we put it into provider spec and sort of prototype this today and do that maybe even in, like, at least in Kappa and possibly in other cluster API providers as well, to sort of start making progress, make sure that everything works, start fleshing it out, and understanding any other proposals that come up better. I'm trying to get us to a code first world, or not code first, but like early code world.
Andy?
Justin, what specifically are you suggesting we prototype in the provider spec?
So as I understand it, correct me, please. We're talking about basically adding some fields to spec and status in the machine object.
Yes.
We could put those instead into the provider spec, and use something akin to reflection to like a known path to like find them regardless of where they are, or just like change it in a fork, right? I guess I'm just sort of asking whether we can proceed and point to a PR that actually looks good and works well.
Did you have anything there, Andy, before moving on?
I had one comment on that. So if we were going to follow Justin's suggestion, which I think is a good one, and I don't know how feasible it is with the invasiveness of this change, but what I would like to see is an example bootstrap controller, right? Like, if I could see an example bootstrap controller that was developed independent. So here's the reason I would like to see it. I'd like to see it because I think it would help make more concrete my understanding and ideas about how this will work. But there's another thing that I think we've overlooked. Part of something that we've done this year that has been really helpful is we've created work streams, we've created more asynchronous communication and more delegation of work. This has helped us make more progress more quickly than I think we did in the prior 18 months that I've been involved in this. However, there is a risk that when a provisional proposal is put up, it can shut down discussion, especially for people that are not as stupid or vocal as I am. So that's the concern, right? I think that by, I think that if you had working code, it would be hard for somebody to come with baseless complaints. But if you have a theoretical idea of something you would like to do, it might be a great idea, but the complaint might just be, I'm not sure that we should agree on this yet.
So I think we have a challenge here in that if we are trying to follow Kubernetes kind of community process, you know, in general for large breaking types of changes, it's generally recommended to come with a KEP versus, you know, not just coming with a large PR that would implement, you know, the type of behavior. You know, especially for some that's disruptive rather than something that's completely additive that can be done kind of out of tree and more easily prototyped. So we have a challenge in, as we define our community processes, how do we want to try to tackle those types of things? You know, and what level do we expect the community to, you know, effort put into before they start implementing something that, you know, of that as well. Because generally for large breaking type of changes, you know, that's, you know, it doesn't make sense to do the design work up front. Does it make sense to do a prototype up front to initiate the design work? That's something that we kind of have to help define as a community how we want to handle those types of things. I do know Vince was the next to have his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, this is V1 Alpha 2. It's early proposal, and like things are gonna change, and they will change. V1 Alpha 1 is not going away. I do share like the same concerns that like others have raised, like about like there's like some open questions. There is like the need for like maybe some code. The main thing is, like Jason mentions, like, should we follow the practices that like Kubernetes has been doing, like given that like we're a sub project? And my instant feeling today is like that should be a yes. And like I mean, we could probably put the work in, but at the same time, the project like has to move forward. Like V1 Alpha 3 may look like something completely different. That's also fine, as long as we have like kind of people that like are backing like work and their ideas. Like I'm completely fine to like throw everything away for V1 Alpha 2 and like move on something else in V1 Alpha 3. But as a project, like I think we should move forward in a way or another.
I believe Moshe was next.
Yeah, so I kind of think that perhaps there's maybe a middle ground here. So maybe not going to the extent of building a bootstrap provider, but maybe building the tests for that provider. So building almost the unit test for that provider, so people can see how a provider would be expected to behave without actually implementing it. Might be a middle ground that's easier or quicker to get done and implemented. Just my 2 cents.
All right, I believe Andy was next.
I'll just +1 to doing a prototype. I think that while it would be ideal to have a fully formulated and agreed upon KEP before we do any coding, I think that having some examples could help work through possible concerns. And it's entirely possible that there's major flaws in this proposal that we'll find out if we do a prototype.
David?
So I just wanted to say that I've heard some opinions here that think that a week is plenty of time, and I know that for some things it is. I would say that for significant KEPs that are having a fair number of comments, like the ones that I've heard here, in API machinery, we hold and try to gain agreement. If someone asks for a reasonable extension, that doesn't seem like an onerous thing, right? The comments that I heard here were very specific around wanting a prototype that demonstrates how something works, wanting to have information about how providers would be integrated to assess the design, and saying from one person who wants to have more time to consider whether perhaps he'd like to have a proposal of his own. I don't quite understand the push here to try to, I don't want to say silence those opinions, but numerous people have expressed it here. Why wouldn't you wait?
So I don't necessarily think that that's necessarily the case. And I think if we do need more than a week to get enough consensus to go ahead and PR to the repo, that's perfectly fine. I think the worry that we have is that this is something that we've been working on for months as a community on how do we decide where do we go from V1 Alpha 1 to the future. And up until recently, we've spent a lot of time going through different processes and different documents, and we really haven't, other than having those discussions, we haven't gotten anywhere where we have anything actionable to move on to for V1 Alpha 2. And part of the desire to go ahead and try to get at least something in place is to start, as was coined by Tim in the face-to-face that we had at KubeCon, is to bias towards action rather than stagnate on continually discussing. And I saw, Tim, you had your hand raised.
I think it's totally reasonable to just let the PR hold and be in provisional until a POC is in place, and then we can have another further discussion. I don't think there's anything that prevents us from having alternative approaches. At the end of the day, it's about people who are going to do the work and actually step up to actually show that they were going to commit to that work. This sub-project, as I mentioned in the face-to-face, has the downfall of doing analysis paralysis. And by time boxing some releases and just getting something out the door, we have an iterative approach. I want to stress that it's alpha, and we are okay with breaking changes, and we will eventually reach consistency. And we are trying to make sure that that contract of alpha is clear. So that way, we are going to iterate, we are going to make mistakes, and that is okay. But we should not sort of gaze into the abyss forever. If people feel more comfortable with holding the PR for a little while longer, I think that's a reasonable approach, and they can put up their own PR to try and PR their own proposal PR as well as POCs.
Pablo?
Just to comment, first is that you mentioned several times that we got into this work stream work and we were into analysis paralysis. I agree, but as again, it's not clear how this will relate. This is something that came out of the blue. Is related. It's something that's the link I'm missing. It's something new. It's fine, but then we spend a lot of work in these streams, and I'm not only talking about this one. I'm talking about, for instance, also other works in the stream, like the extension mechanisms. We will follow the same pattern that we would just basically forget what we did in the stream, and somebody will land a proposal, or anyone. I mean, not someone. Anyone can land a new proposal. I don't know. And second, I second the comment. I can't remember who that's saying that having code will right a lot the bar for even continue the discussion, because there was some implementation and this is good enough for some people. Then I am afraid, for one hand, it's good to have some implementation because you have some practical way to test the idea. I like that, but it's easily be confused with a reference implementation. So we need to balance that. I mean, I'm not against the idea at all. Actually, we'll jump into that if we decide to do it, but it's important not to implicitly present it as a reference architect implementation that can be refined later, or it's just an experiment. I would suggest that don't even be as part of the Cluster API repository at all, just external repository.
So I just want to add that we do have other items on the agenda, and I want to make sure that we at least have some time to get to them. But you're next, Vince.
I just wanted, to close this discussion and just saying, like, if that's okay, like, let's just open the PR and remove the timeout for now. And as we if we do have a lot of comments, as David and Tim suggested, we can keep the PR open until we reach consensus, and then we can close it. Probably like in the next few meetings, community meetings, like we'll need to kind of reach consensus. So I would expect the time frame to at some point to get this PR merged or rejected as we go.
Thank you, Vince. So going back to the user story topic, Doug, you had provided a lot of the use cases under Leah's item. I believe Vince has already added them to the reference document. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss there?
No, I thought Leah's idea was, or pointing that out was great, and I just thought I'd take a stab at adding a few. So I don't know, Vince, did you pull any of the use cases from the other documents that we had been working on before this one as well, or just the ones that were here in the meeting notes?
I haven't yet. I might do that after the meeting.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, and you had the next item on the agenda, Doug, with the version string and the machine spec.
Yeah. So it wasn't really clear to me how much of the details you wanted to get into in this meeting versus waiting for that pull request and have code review comments there versus. So is this the sort of thing that you meant when you said put comments in the agenda doc? I guess it was Andy and Vince that had said that.
Yeah, so it's mostly that we can chat synchronously.
Yeah.
Do you want me to just go on each one of these and just kind of provide a small answer to those, or maybe we can just wait for the PR? It's up to you. We have 2 minutes for each. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to just sort of, I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read this. I'm looking at it on my tall screen, realizing I typed out a wall of text, so I apologize for that. But none of them is particularly big, so I think we could just sort of zip through them all.
Okay.
The first one, the version string, Michael pointed this out on the Google Doc, but I think the important thing there is that it's not really clear to me exactly how that field's going to be used. If it is meant to be used to orchestrate upgrade, so something would come along and say, now this machine needs to be running this version instead of the version it had before, then there's a concern there about having to make multiple updates to different objects in order to make that work. So the Bootstrap might need a whole different image or something like that in order for, or I guess that would be the infrastructure. So you'd have to update the infrastructure object to give it a new image, as well as updating the version number on this object. And that's 2 API calls, so that's a race condition. So I wonder if that's the right place for it, but maybe I'm also misinterpreting what it's for.
So the basic idea behind this versioning spec is to the user would say I want this version of Kubernetes, but the field itself is optional, which if you have a Bootstrap provider and the infrastructure provider that don't care about this field, this could be either informational or it could be empty.
It's not so much about whether it's optional or not, it's where it lives. So if in order to upgrade, I have to also change the image because I need a new version of the OS in order to even support that version of Kubernetes, then you have to make 2 changes, and they're on 2 different objects, right? And you can't do that in one call. So you have a race condition where the controller is going to see information that it can't successfully reconcile the host to do the upgrade. So I don't mind that we have the field. I'm just concerned about the way it would actually be used.
So I saw David had his hand raised.
I just wanted to comment that I think the field should be optional. In most cases, users do not need to specify the version on a per machine basis, but the use case that making this optional field available allows is for you to create a bare machine. Anyway.
Andy?
I'll add that in terms of immutability, we had talked at the face-to-face at KubeCon about, is the machine mutable or immutable? Is the server / host / instance mutable or immutable? And I believe what we came to agreement on was that the machine custom resource could be mutated. So if for this example, you could change the version value in the machine spec, and then the underlying server should be immutable. But there are cases where certain distributions or certain providers would be interested in doing in-place upgrades. And I had some time to think about that, and I'm tempted to suggest that the way that we use this version field is it's an intent for a Kubernetes version or distribution version that is what's provisioned on the underlying infrastructure for a machine. But if you did want to have an update, an in-place update, I'd like to suggest that it not be this field that you change, and that instead you set this to the empty string. So treat it as an optional field. And for OpenShift, for example, I believe you have a separate custom resource or some sort of configuration object where you specify the version, and that's distinct from the machine. So one way to achieve in-place upgrades possibly for OpenShift would be you set this machine spec version to blank and then manage the version in your OpenShift configuration. And so I think like that's a possibility. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And then in terms of a race condition possibility and having to keep the machine spec version in sync with a kubeadm bootstrap config or an OpenShift config, I think we would probably take the approach of immutable machines. And so we wouldn't do an in-place upgrade. And if you wanted to go from 113 to 114, you would not be changing a machine's spec version. You would be creating a replacement machine. And so it's two different modes of operation that both support upgrades, where one is machines, both the machine custom resource and the underlying server are immutable, and a second being the machine stays immutable, but the custom bootstrap config could be mutated, and you could do in-place upgrades that way.
Okay, yeah. So that I think the short version of that is it's not necessarily meant to do upgrades. It's not part of orchestrating an upgrade. Okay, well that resolves some of my concern. There is still a concern that you could have an image specified in the infrastructure block that doesn't support the version of Kubernetes that's requested. But I don't know that we can get away from that unless we have some, really canonical versioning management thing that knows about all the images in the world. So yeah, that's fine.
There definitely has to be a line where we say, if you cross this line, you can go shoot yourself in the foot.
Yeah. Okay. As long as that's not with the orchestration of upgrades, that's fine.
Michael, did you have anything before we moved on from this topic?
Yes, just quickly on the topic of mutability versus immutability, that's obviously a conversation we need to have. That obviously impacts the decision-making of this document, and I think there's some unstated assumptions that this document is attempting to codify, and we should be explicit about those immutability assumptions in this particular proposal so we can have discussion points around those items instead of just discussing them live on the call.
Tim?
I think we should spell it out more concretely, but we did have a very long conversation during the face-to-face, which is actually listed in the document, this document down below, which specifically calls out that, this is one of the constraints. It's on me currently to do two things after that face-to-face. One is to update taxonomy and a glossary or reference of how we talk about terms, because one of the problems we had at the face-to-face is we kind of talked past each other, even though we were in violent agreement. The second of which was that we did decide and agree as a larger group with everybody there, at least at that point in time, about the constraints of treating the machine instances, the actual instantiation of the machine itself, not necessarily the spec, that they would be considered immutable from the cluster API perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use another tool to do whatever you want for in place.
David?
Thanks. I thought Andy misspoke earlier, but based on Andrew's comment, maybe I misunderstand. I think this is an important clarification. The machine resource is the thing that I believe is immutable. The underlying physical machine is the thing that is outside of the scope of the API, and that is mutable. So that's how you would implement an in-place upgrade, right? But the actual Kubernetes machine resource is being modeled as a pod resource is. You can't change the image of a pod, right? You have to create a new pod with a new image. And I thought that's what we voted and agreed on at KubeCon.
It is. Again, we need to come to consensus on taxonomy. We are in violent agreement talking about things slightly differently.
Thanks.
Pablo?
No, just the previous comment was exactly the same I was just about to make. Thanks.
All right, with that said, let's move on to the next topic, which is the controller status reporting.
Yeah, so there's a string field there for it's called the controller phase type. And I just thought it would be useful to have a machine readable value and a human, like a much more verbose human readable value. So I thought making that a 2-part field would be useful. And then I had the question about if we do that, or even if we don't, if it's just a string, it's declared as a type. Does that mean that we have an enum somewhere that we're going to define of what those values can be? And how do we sort of make a union of all the possible things that every provider could give us?
Andy?
Yeah, this isn't necessarily super fleshed out, but I think this is something that will come as part of either further revisions to the CAP or prototyping. So I don't think there's too much contention here. Just we'll figure it out together as we go along.
Yeah. Well, like I said, these are all little things. So, did anybody else have any questions on this one, or should we move on to that? Yeah. So the running state is tied to the thing that gets created becoming a node. And we already have node state somewhere else. So I wonder if we need to couple those two things together, or if it's good enough to say that the thing that you created is alive and you can talk to it, and that means it's running, whether or not it actually has all the Kubernetes stuff on top of it yet.
Because we have, because we're separating the Bootstrap controller mechanism, you could do whatever you want in the Bootstrap controller to consider the transition to state running. It's the kind of implied semantic that it is actually ready to become part of a cluster, because the purpose of cluster API is to stand up clusters for Kubernetes. So if folks wanted to implement their own Bootstrap controller, they could transition to the running state on their own, and it could still go through a separate thing. if you wanted to. But if you look at the state machine diagram, there exists the pre and the post operations for transitions. Those pre and the post would allow you to do whatever pre-provisioning you wanted to. So it's a dealer's choice, to be honest.
Yeah, so there's two things in what you said that concern me a little bit. We've talked about wanting to build this up as layers, and it feels like a layer violation to say that a machine is only running when it becomes a node, which is managed by some other thing. So that's the initial part of the question.
It's
the second
running,
thing
it's a running
is focusing on, hold on,
machine.
let me finish saying. So the other thing was focusing on that state machine. My understanding was that the state machine was present so that we could reason about all of this, but that we weren't going to build anything that assumed those states in that particular way. Exactly for the reason that you just said, which is different controllers might not need certain content or state to exist in order to do their work. And so they wouldn't necessarily follow the state machine that we've documented, but that was a thing that we could talk about between ourselves so that we understood what we meant by what state a host was in, and also so that users could look at it and say, oh, well, it's partway done, but it's not all the way done and it has more work to do, whatever that actually ends up having to be. So, but it sounds like maybe that's not a valid assumption about what that state machine is for.
I see other people have their hands raised, so I want to give them a chance to talk.
David?
So 2 comments. I think states are one of the most problematic portions of this. I also want to reiterate that states are absolutely essential for user interface implementers. So we will have to solve that problem. Final comment is that we spent a lot of time talking about how to create a running state for machine objects. We decided that we would not, and we deferred to using the node status. The reason being there are scalability issues with maintaining node status, and we did not want to make a poor recreation of that effort. And so we may need to discuss this again, but there was violent agreement last year that the node resource status is the de facto status of the machine.
Pablo?
Yes, for one hand, I understand the concern that Doug presented regarding tying the status of the machine to the node, but on the other hand, we should keep in mind that we are trying to bring up cluster nodes. But it's also true that if for whatever reason the configuration of this node is wrong for whatever reason, and it's not a responsibility of the machine controller to handle that, and the node never gets active in the cluster, how to differentiate that? So probably we're missing something in the middle of this one, these two elements. Neither have a generic status of the machine, underlying machine is running, because we don't want to just bring a virtual machine. But the other part, how to detect that it's running. We try to bring it up, but for whatever reason it's not, because otherwise we'll keep trying killing machine and bringing new machine with the same configuration, having the same issue. I don't have an answer to this. It's only the, for me, it smells like we are probably missing something in the middle.
Tim?
So the machine state sequence diagram and the changes there are specifically meant to allow custom bootstrap ordering. And if we want to change the name of certain things or possibly enumerate other states of what we consider running or not, we can always change the language there. But it's the supposition that once we get to a running state that it is joined, it is actually active for, it's an active machine, but it's possible that it's not the canonical reference, but the purpose of those states is for custom bootstrap ordering of bringing machines online. So that's the intent. As well as like the pre and post portions of those states the edges, or the arrows, I should say, are where the custom integrations for your given providers exist to allow them to do their whatever specific integrations they need. This was kind of a compromise that existed in the Node Lifecycle group. And we had lots of discussion around this one. This one's pretty much lift and shift from the conversations that we had from that group.
David?
If you're talking, David, we can't hear you.
I am. So sorry. I've been listening for a while, and I've heard multiple people from multiple different places saying they're having difficulty reconciling the idea that a machine would have node status indications on it, and the relationship isn't clear. And I can say I'm thinking the same thing, but I'm not super familiar with the proposal. Maybe this doc trying to describe these states should work on convincing those people that that is the actual way they want to manage the machines, or perhaps we should listen to the feedback and consider that machines are different than nodes.
Vince?
Machines being different from the node, like I would reiterate that like it's in the cluster API scope and objective that we want to spin up Kubernetes clusters. So the short answer to that, like let's say like it's probably no. To your the other point that you expressed, we have like a pretty thorough sequence diagram here that like a user creates a machine and goes to every step that multiple controllers make and like how they talk to the API server and what actions they take, and there is description to each one of them. And I would like suggest to everybody that like wants to get more familiar with this proposal to actually go into this sequence, like in this scenario, and like kind of making sure that like maybe like it fits their use case or like propose like changes to it.
David?
I may be unfamiliar with how this SIG works, but I'm used to having situations where an API that's trying to be established to have participation and implementations by multiple disjoint sets of people is usually focused on trying to get buy-in from all those people. And the feedback from people actually doing the implementing about whether or not they think an API is suitable. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding the comments from David and from Doug and from Pablo, but I took them to mean that they looked at it, they tried to figure out how they would work with it, and they have reservations about using it. I don't think that no is an appropriate answer.
We could take this offline. I was mostly talking about like making machine their own like separate thing API. It's tied up to like getting a node up and running, a Kubernetes node up and running. That's the clarification that I wanted to make.
Yeah, I don't have any issue with that in particular. Like I said, I just feel like it's a layer violation to say that the state of this thing doesn't ever go to ready until, or to running until some other object somewhere exists and also has that state that this code would have no influence over. So I feel like
so I think
maybe
one important
renaming that state is appropriate, like Tim said, or adding another state in there or something to say, you know, we've done all of our work and now we are waiting for the node to come around.
Yeah,
so I think one thing we need to keep in mind too is that machine sets and machine deployments are meant to be able to build up things analogous to node pools in managed service providers. So at some point we need to have some distinction of when those backing machines are actual nodes, whether that's actually a status on the node or some other way. You know, we can argue that over, but at the end of the day, you know, there needs to be a way to manage pools of, Kubernetes nodes. And Tim.
I agree with Doug. I think we're on the same page here. That if folks want to refine the state machine or modify the existing states, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. We talked about it quite a bit, and I'm sorry if other folks weren't involved in the other conversations, but please do offer recommended solutions or changes to the state machine.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that. I think we're at time, aren't we? What's the schedule?
Yeah, we're at time. Let's go ahead and try to take the remainder of the items offline, and if we need to, we can follow up next week on them.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.